The cabin had always been a refuge, a stubborn sentinel of timber and stone, wedged between frosted pines where winter reigned unchecked. This year, the snows came early, burying the dirt road and sealing us in, Clara, the grandmother, and Liam, the grandson. Or so I had believed, until the solstice night unraveled everything. Liam arrived at dusk, his boots crunching through the icy crust of the driveway. At 23, he was taller than I remembered, his frame lean but hardened, shoulders squared beneath a woolen coat. His face, half hidden by a scarf, held the sharp angles of adulthood, though his eyes, green as the firs that encircled us, still carried the quiet intensity that had always unnerved me. When he stepped inside, snowflakes melting in his dark hair, he paused to survey the room. The firelight caught the curve of his jaw, and for a heartbeat, I saw her, my daughter, Alara. In the tilt of his brow, "You kept the old place alive," he said, shrugging off his gloves. His voice was deeper now, roughened by time or secrets. "Someone had to," I replied, stirring the stew simmering over the hearth. The lie tasted bitter. Alara had been the one who loved this cabin, who'd filled its cracks with laughter before she vanished, leaving only a note and a newborn. Liam, the days fell into rhythm. We rose at dawn, our breaths pluming in the frigid air, and split firewood in the shed. His axe bit into the logs with practiced ease, the thud echoing my own strikes. Sometimes our shoulders brushed as we worked, the contact fleeting but electric. He'd glance at me then, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Before turning back to his task evenings, we read by the fire. Dickens, Bronte, dog-eared paperbacks salvaged from dusty shelves. Liam's voice, low and deliberate, wove tales of ghosts and moors, while the flames cast shadows that danced like silent witnesses. Once, as he read a passage about forbidden love, his finger traced the edge of the page, lingering. My throat tightened, nights were the hardest. The cabin groaned under the weight of the snow, and the floorboards above my bedroom creaked with his restless pacing. Sometimes, he'd pause outside my door, his shadow trembling on the threshold. I'd hold my breath, pulse racing, until his footsteps retreated. The blizzard struck midweek, howling like a wounded beast. We were marooned, the world reduced to the crackle of the hearth and the scrape of spoons against bowls. Liam grew bolder. He left a sprig of winterberry on my nightstand, its crimson berries stark against the pine. Another day, he repaired the broken lantern, his hands steady as he twisted the wires, his sleeves rolled to reveal forearms dusted with dark hair. When our fingers brushed passing a teacup, he didn't pull away. "You're different here," he said one evening, staring into the fire. The flames gilded his profile, softening the edges of his severity. "Different how?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. He turned, his gaze searing. "Alive." New Year's Eve arrived, the radio coughing to life with a staticky waltz. We'd shared a bottle of spiced wine, its warmth pooling in my veins, and when Liam offered his hand, I took it. His palm was calloused, his grip firm as he pulled me into a sway. The music faded, but we kept dancing, closer now, his breath hot at my temple. "Clara," he murmured, my name a confession. I should have stopped. But the years between us, the lies, the loneliness, crumbled like ash. His lips found mine, hesitant at first, then urgent. The room spun, the firelight dimming as he guided me to the worn sofa, his hands trembling against my waist. What followed was wordless, a tangle of muffled breaths and fumbling buttons, the storm outside drowning our guilt. Afterward, he traced the silver locket at my throat, the one I'd worn since Alara disappeared. "Open it," he urged, voice frayed inside. The photograph stared back. My daughter at 19, radiant and hollow-eyed, cradling a newborn. Liam's eyes met mine. "She left a letter. You're not my grandmother." The truth froze the air. The cabin, the decades of pretense, all of it. He'd known. Always known now. Dawn bleeds through the curtains. Liam sleeps beside me, a stranger in the wreckage of my naivety. The locket sits cold against my skin, its chain a noose of silver. Outside, the thaw begins, fissures spreading through the ice. But some winters, once broken, never truly end. The thaw came slowly, dripping from the eaves like tears. By midday, the snow softened to slush, revealing patches of frozen earth beneath, a world unraveling. Just like us, Liam avoided me at first. He retreated to the attic, where Alara's old trunk gathered dust, its latches rusted shut. I'd hear him pacing above, footsteps heavy with the weight of unsaid things. When he descended, his eyes were hollow, his hands clenched around a yellowed envelope. "You kept her secrets," he said, tossing it onto the table. The letter inside, Alara's spidery script, confessed everything. Her affair with a married man, her flight from shame, her plea for me to raise Liam as my own. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question hung between us, sharp as an axe. "Because I loved you too much to lose you," I thought. But guilt choked the words that night. He found me in the garden, the moonlight carving silver paths through the snow. The cold bit my cheeks, but I didn't move. Not when his boots crunched behind me. Not when his breath warmed the nape of my neck. "You're not my blood," he said, voice low. "But you're the only family I've ever known." I turned, and there it was, the raw ache in his gaze, the same hunger that had devoured us days before. This time, there were no lies to hide behind. His kiss was desperate, a collision of guilt and need, his fingers tangling in my hair like roots seeking purchase. We stumbled inside, shedding layers like old skins, the fire casting our shadows against the wall, a pantomime of lovers, not grandmother and grandson. Afterward, he traced the scar on my shoulder, a relic from a childhood fall. "I used to think this was from saving me," he murmured. "Now I wonder what else you've lied about." Spring arrived, brittle and reluctant. The villagers returned, their voices carrying across the thawing lake. Mrs. Harlow knocked once, bearing a jar of preserves and narrowed eyes. "Heard you had company this winter," she said, peering past me to where Liam chopped wood, shirtless and sweating. I shut the door quietly, my pulse a wild thing. That evening, I found him packing, his belongings stuffed into Alara's trunk. "Where will you go?" I asked, though I already knew a way. He said, not meeting my gaze. "Before we destroy each other." He left at dawn, the sunrise staining the sky bloody. I watched from the porch, the locket clenched in my fist, until his figure vanished into the pines. The cabin sighed around me, emptier than ever. In his room, I found a sketch tucked beneath the pillow, a winter scene, the cabin half buried in snow, two shadows blurred together in the window. On the back, a single line, "Some fires never die." The thaw quickened, the lake cracking open with a sound like a sob. I stood at its edge, the locket in my palm, and let it slip into the dark water. Alara's ghost could rest now, but mine? Mine was just beginning. The days after Liam left stretched long and hollow, each one a mirror of the last. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to lean closer, the air thick with the weight of what we'd done, what I'd allowed to happen. I told myself it was over, that the thaw had washed away the sins of winter. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The first week, I kept busy. I scrubbed the floors until my hands were raw, rearranged the bookshelves, and even tried to fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen. But no matter how much I worked, I couldn't outrun the memories. The way his hands had felt on my skin, the way his voice had cracked when he said my name, it all lingered, like a ghost I couldn't exorcise. Night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the creak of floorboards that never came. Sometimes, I'd swear I heard his footsteps outside, but when I looked, there was only the wind, howling through the pines. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the door like a secret. I recognized his handwriting immediately, sharp and angular, just like him. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. "Clara, I don't know if you'll read this. Maybe you'll burn it, and I wouldn't blame you. But I had to write. I had to tell you that I can't stop thinking about you. About us. I know it's wrong. I know it's twisted. But it's the truth. I'm in the city now. It's loud here, chaotic. Nothing like the cabin. But even here, I can't escape you. Everywhere I go, I see your face. I hear your voice. It's like you're haunting me. I don't know what this means. I don't know if I'll ever come back. But I needed you to know that you're not alone in this. Whatever this is, Liam. I read it twice, then a third time, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to burn it, to erase the words and the feelings they stirred. But another part, a darker, hungrier part, clutched the letter to my chest, as if it could fill the void he'd left behind. The days turned into weeks, and still, I couldn't shake him. I tried to distract myself with small tasks, baking bread, knitting, even attempting to paint the porch, but nothing worked. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. Every time I touched my skin, I felt him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself standing at the edge of the lake, the water dark and still. The locket was gone, but its absence only made the memory sharper. I thought about Alara, about the choices she'd made and the life she'd left behind. I thought about Liam, about the boy I'd raised and the man he'd become. And I thought about myself, about the woman I was and the woman I'd allowed myself to become. The knock came late that night, just as I was about to blow out the candles. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. Then, slowly, I walked to the door, my pulse racing. He stood on the porch, his face shadowed by the dim light. His hair was longer, his jaw sharper, but his eyes, those piercing green eyes, were the same. Liam, I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't say anything, just stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a storm. For a long moment, we stood there, staring at each other, the air between us crackling with tension. I couldn't stay away, he said finally, his voice rough. I wanted to tell him to leave, to turn him away and end this madness. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached for him, my fingers brushing his cheek. He flinched, but didn't pull away. This is wrong, I whispered, even as I leaned into him. I know, he said, his breath warm against my skin. But I don't care. What followed was a blur of heat and desperation, a collision of bodies and souls that left us both breathless. We didn't speak, didn't think, just clung to each other, as if the world outside didn't exist. Afterward, we lay in the dark, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. His arm was draped over me, his heartbeat steady against my back. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace, but even as I drifted off to sleep, a part of me knew this couldn't last. The world outside was still there, waiting to tear us apart. And sooner or later, it would come knocking. The days after Liam's return were a fragile truce, a delicate balance between guilt and desire. We didn't talk about what had happened, didn't put words to the thing that bound us. Instead, we fell into a rhythm, a quiet coexistence that felt both familiar and foreign. He stayed in the attic, as if trying to maintain some semblance of distance. But the distance was an illusion. I could feel him everywhere, in the creak of the stairs, in the way the air seemed to shift when he entered a room, in the heat of his gaze when he thought I wasn't looking. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found him in the garden, his hands buried in the soil. He was planting something, wildflowers, maybe, or herbs. I watched him for a moment, the way his shoulders moved as he worked, the way his hair fell into his eyes. You've always had a green thumb, I said, my voice breaking the silence. He looked up, startled, then smiled, a small, hesitant thing. It's something to do, he said, brushing dirt from his hands. Keeps me busy. I knelt beside him, the earth cool beneath my knees. You don't have to hide up there, you know, I said, gesturing toward the attic. This is your home, too. He didn't respond, just stared at the ground, his jaw tight. For a moment, I thought he might pull away, retreat back into himself. But then he reached for my hand, his fingers rough against my skin. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Neither do I said, squeezing his hand. But we'll figure it out. The nights were the hardest. The cabin was too small, the walls too thin. I'd lie awake, listening to the sound of his breathing, the soft creak of the floorboards as he paced. Sometimes, I'd hear him stop outside my door, his shadow lingering on the threshold. And sometimes, I'd open the door, letting him in without a word. What happened between us in those moments was a secret, a thing we didn't speak of in the light of day. It was desperate and raw, a collision of guilt and need that left us both breathless. But even as we clung to each other, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the edge of something dangerous. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter. It arrived one morning, slipped under the door like a snake. I recognized the handwriting immediately, Mrs. Harlow's, sharp and precise. "Clara, I don't know what's going on in that cabin of yours, but the whole village is talking. They say Liam's back, and that he's been there for weeks. They say you've been seen together, acting strange. I don't want to believe the rumors, but I can't ignore them either. You need to be careful. For both your sakes, Margaret." I crumpled the letter in my fist, my heart pounding. The villagers had always been nosy, but this was different. This was dangerous. That evening, I confronted Liam. He was in the attic, sorting through Alara's old things. "When I found him, we need to talk," I said, my voice tight. He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What's wrong?" I handed him the letter, watching as his expression shifted from confusion to anger. "They don't know anything," he said, tossing the letter aside. "Let them talk." "It's not that simple," I said, my voice rising. "If they find out, if they even suspect, we'll lose everything." He stood, his face inches from mine. "What do you want me to do, Clara? Leave? Pretend this never happened?" "I don't know," I shouted, my voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." For a long moment, we stood there, staring at each other, the air between us crackling with tension. Then, slowly, he reached for me, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice soft. "Together." But the peace didn't last. The next day, the villagers came. They arrived at dawn, their voices carrying across the frozen lake. Mrs. Harlow was at the front, her face grim, her arms crossed over her chest. Behind her stood a handful of others, men and women I'd known my whole life, their faces twisted with suspicion. "Clara," Mrs. Harlow said, her voice sharp. "We need to talk." I stepped onto the porch, my heart pounding. "What's this about?" "It's about Liam," she said, her eyes narrowing. "People are talking. They say he's been here for weeks, that you've been close." I felt Liam's presence behind me before I saw him. He stepped onto the porch, his face hard, his eyes blazing. "This is none of your business," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Mrs. Harlow flinched, but didn't back down. "It is our business when it affects the whole village. We have a right to know what's going on here." "Nothing's going on," I said, my voice trembling. "Liam's my grandson. He's family." "Is he?" Mrs. Harlow asked, her gaze piercing. "Because some of us remember Alara. We remember the rumors. And we remember the boy she left behind." The words hit like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Liam stepped forward, his fists clenched, but I stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the villagers turned and walked away, their whispers trailing behind them. That night, we sat by the fire, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "They'll be back," Liam said finally, his voice grim. "I know," I said, staring into the flames. "What are we going to do?" I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know. The villagers didn't wait long to return. 2 days after their first visit, they came again, this time in greater numbers. Their voices carried across the frozen lake, sharp and accusing, as they marched toward the cabin. I stood on the porch, my heart pounding, my hands clenched at my sides. Liam was beside me, his face hard, his eyes blazing with defiance. "Clara," Mrs. Harlow called, her voice cutting through the cold air. "We need answers." "You've had your answers," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear coiling in my chest. "Liam is my grandson. That's all you need to know." "Is it?" She shot back, her gaze narrowing. "Because the way you two have been acting, it's not normal. People are talking. And if you don't set the record straight, we will." Liam stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You don't get to come here and make demands," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is our home. Our lives. You have no right. We have every right, Mrs. Harlow snapped. This village is our home too. And we won't stand by while you two. Enough, I shouted, my voice ringing out like a gunshot. The crowd fell silent, their eyes wide with shock. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I stepped off the porch. You want the truth?
Fine.
Here it is. Liam is not my grandson. He's the son of my daughter, Alara, who left him with me when he was just a baby. She's gone, and I raised him as my own. That's all there is to it. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. That's not the whole story, someone called. We've seen the way you look at each other. Another added, it's unnatural, Mrs. Harlow said, her voice cold. I felt Liam's hand on my arm, his grip tight. Let's go inside, he murmured, but I shook my head, my eyes locked on the crowd.
No.
They need to hear this. I turned to face them, my heart pounding fiercely in my chest, each beat echoing my rising anxiety. You want to judge us?
Fine.
But before you do, ask yourselves this. What would you do for love? What would you sacrifice? What lines would you cross? Because love isn't always clean and neat. It isn't always easy or straightforward. Sometimes it's messy and complicated. Sometimes it's painful and full of heartache. But it's real. And it belongs to us. A thick silence enveloped the crowd, their faces displaying a mixture of shock and disbelief, as if my words had struck them like a physical blow. For a fleeting moment, I thought they might choose to leave, to turn and walk away from the confrontation. But then Mrs. Harlow stepped forward, her eyes blazing with indignation and fury. This isn't love, she declared, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. This is sin. And we won't stand for it. Not now, not ever. Before I could muster a response, Liam stepped in front of me, his body acting as a shield between me and the hostile crowd. You've said your piece, he said, his voice icy and unwavering. Now leave. Before I make you. The crowd hesitated, their eyes darting between Liam and me, weighing their options as if searching for a sign of weakness. Then, slowly, they began to disperse, their whispers trailing behind them like a fading storm. That night, we sat by the fire, the silence between us heavy and thick with unspoken words, each of us lost in our thoughts. The flames danced in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but the warmth they provided couldn't penetrate the chill that had settled in my heart. They'll be back, Liam said finally, breaking the oppressive silence, his voice grim and filled with foreboding. I know, I replied, staring into the flames, trying to find comfort in their glow but feeling only dread. What are we going to do? He pressed, his expression serious, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know what we could do. The uncertainty loomed over us like a dark cloud. The next morning, I woke to the sound of voices outside, a murmur that grew louder and more insistent. I stepped onto the porch, my heart sinking as I saw the crowd gathered at the edge of the property. This time, they weren't alone. With them was a man I didn't recognize, a stranger in a suit, his face stern and his eyes cold, radiating authority and disapproval. Clara, Mrs. Harlow called, her voice sharp and cutting through the morning air. This is Mr. Thompson. He's from Child Protective Services. My blood ran cold at her words, a chill creeping down my spine.
What?
I managed to stammer, disbelief coursing through me. We've filed a complaint, she continued, her gaze piercing and unyielding. About the situation here. He's here to investigate. I felt Liam's presence behind me before I even saw him. He stepped onto the porch, his face hard and his eyes blazing with defiance. This is bullshit, he said, his voice low and dangerous, a growl that hinted at the storm brewing inside him. Language, young man, Mr. Thompson replied, his tone clipped and professional. I'm here to ensure the safety and well-being of everyone involved. Now, if you'll come with me. No, I interjected, stepping forward with determination. You're not taking him. I'm afraid I don't have a choice, Mr. Thompson replied, his voice cold and unyielding. Until this matter is resolved, Liam will need to be placed in protective custody. I'm not a child, Liam snapped, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, rage radiating from him. You're underage in the eyes of the law, Mr. Thompson stated, his gaze unwavering and firm. Now, please come quietly. For a moment, no one moved, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, slowly, Liam stepped forward, his eyes locked on mine, a silent exchange passing between us. It's okay, he said, his voice softening, filled with a bittersweet reassurance. I'll be back. I wanted to argue, to fight back, to do something, anything, to stop this from happening. But I couldn't. All I could do was watch helplessly as they led him away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the forest. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and despair. I tried to keep busy, to distract myself with small tasks around the cabin, but nothing worked. The place felt unbearably empty without him, the silence echoing around me like a haunting melody that refused to fade. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I opened it, and there he was, Liam, his face bruised but his eyes blazing with determination and defiance. I'm not going back, he said, his voice firm and resolute, as if he had made a vow. What happened? I asked, my voice trembling with concern and anxiety. I ran, he said, stepping inside, the warmth of his presence flooding the room. I'm not letting them tear us apart. Not now, not ever. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other, the air between us crackling with tension and unspoken promises. Then, slowly, I reached for him, my fingers brushing his cheek, tracing the lines of his face, as if to reassure myself that he was really there. This is dangerous, I whispered, my heart racing with fear for both of us. I don't care, he said, his voice rough and filled with raw emotion. I'd rather die than lose you. What followed was a blur of heat and desperation, a collision of bodies and souls that left us both breathless and longing for more. We didn't speak, didn't think, just clung to each other tightly, as if the world outside didn't exist, as if nothing else mattered but this moment we had created together. But the world outside was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to tear us apart. And sooner or later, it would come knocking, demanding its due.